A black woman walked into the courtroom to observe the proceedings. 10 minutes later, she was handcuffed and dragged out like a criminal by those who were supposed to protect justice, not because she was causing trouble, not because she broke the law, but because she dared to speak up to remind everyone to be quiet in the most solemn place, the federal courthouse. What the two security officers did not expect was that the woman was no stranger. She was Naomi Carter, Deputy Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice, and her public humiliation in front of cameras, in front of witnesses, unleashed a seismic storm, bringing the entire justice system to its knees. So what happened next? How could the entire courthouse look the other way while justice was trampled? And how did Naomi turn her humiliation into the beginning of a historic reform? Stay tuned until the end, and don't forget to subscribe because you're about to hear one of the most shocking true stories about justice, discrimination, and awakening that America can't afford to ignore. Naomi Carter, 47, Deputy Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Justice, is left in the middle of a construction site, a woman of color with a history of relentless pursuit of justice. Her wrists are twisted behind her back, the weight of the cold iron bracelet spreading up to her shoulders, making every muscle scream. Instead, her face usually a picture of peace, intelligence, and self-control. In front of her, Officer Joel Ramsey, who made the arrest, is tall, muscular, his head shaved, his sinewy arms clamped around her wrists as if she were a wanted criminal. Standing across from him, Officer Brent Maddox, who had ordered the handcuffs, was the embodiment of corrupting power. A 42-year-old white man with a military-style haircut. His face creased with anger and strength, his hands clasped in front of him as if he were checking the situation. Maddox smiled brightly, full of contempt. "An order is an order. You are in violation of courtroom rules. You are charged with disorderly conduct, failure to obey orders, and obstruction of public officials. We have the right to remove you from here." The words were blunt, but not because of the content, because it was so white and absurd that it was unbelievable. Naomi gasped, her eyes no longer holding their normal calm. She did not shout, nor did she have a conflict zone. Instead, she said, in a steady voice, but each word falling into thin air with a measured weight, "I am the Deputy Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice. This conduct is unlawful. You have no authority to lay hands on me. There was no fraud as frozen." Ramsey looked at Maddox. Maddox, for a moment, paused, but then she burst out laughing, a laugh that seemed to cover up a fleeting embarrassment. "You think wearing that nice suit, what is that soul name, can sit and give orders? This could be my courtroom, not your office." Maddox's every word was like a thin knife, cutting deep into the self-esteem of a woman who had spent her career defending the law. In the public seats, those who were there early, some lawyers reported family members, building staff, no one said a word. They just knew each other, exchanged stunned glances, whispered in between horror. All were being shown to be a black woman, being detailed and suppressed just because she opened the request for honor in the courtroom. Minutes earlier, they had seen her walk in. Confident steps, designer-style, elegant black leather ring on her hand. No one knew her identity, but one thing everyone knew. She had done nothing wrong. Naomi felt as if time had turned back. Images from the past flashed through her mind like fragments the first time she was questioned by the police for driving at night as a Harvard student, the time she was turned away from housing despite a letter of recommendation from her law professor. But never, not once, had she been handcuffed in the place she trusted most. The courthouse. It was more than a personal insult. It was a betrayal by the legal system of its own protector. Ramsey began to pull her out of her seat toward the front door. Her high heels clicked on the stone floor, each step like an alarm bell. Naomi turned and looked around. Some people avoided her eyes. A few especially. The middle-aged women looked at her with a mixture of desperate sympathy. They realized they could be her even if they said the wrong thing or simply existed in the wrong skin color, the wrong gender, the wrong place. Then she stopped. In the middle of the courtroom, she turned to Maddox, her hands still behind her back, but her gaze now sharp as a plow. "You will suffer. This is not order, this is illegal. And I will not be silent." The room held its breath. Maddox blushed. But before she could respond, Naomi turned away. There was nothing left to say. There was nothing left to prove. The truth was in the crowd's beauty, and in the deep red scars that were clearly visible on her wrists. It was a Monday morning like any other in Washington, D.C. A gentle late spring breeze caressed the cool marble of the federal courthouse. From the outside, the building still held its usual solemnity, a seemingly unshakable symbol of American justice. And among the silent crowd streaming toward the courthouse, a woman walked slowly but firmly enough to make people move out of her way on instinct. No one recognized her. No one knew that beneath the pale gray coat and white silk scarf was one of the most powerful figures in the United States Department of Justice, Deputy Inspector General Naomi Carter. Naomi could have sent an official memo. She could have requested a reception room, notified the judge, even convened a panel of judges. But she chose not to. Instead, she chose to appear quietly, like a private citizen, who has the right to observe a public trial of discrimination in a public agency. Because sometimes an unannounced presence is the most honest tool for observing what's really going on. The engagement began with an overlooked report. A few weeks earlier, Naomi had found a thick file on her desk, containing a complaint from a group of African American and Latino employees of the Ashford City Housing Department. They alleged that they had been passed over for promotions assigned to the riskiest jobs and routinely threatened and insulted by their white superiors. At first, like all complaints, it was included in the initial review process. But when the preliminary investigation team reported that there were no obvious signs of systemic misconduct, Naomi didn't believe it. Not because of emotion, but because of the intuition of someone who has spent 15 years investigating cases that others consider insufficient evidence. She has seen the truth buried under polite smiles, formal documents, and sweet promises from people who are too accustomed to unlimited power. Naomi cannot let this case fall into oblivion like hundreds of other cases that have been closed for lack of confirmatory evidence. And she knows if she wants to see for herself whether a system is protecting justice or not, she must go to the trial itself, sneak in, and observe. Naomi arrived early, choosing a seat in the public gallery right in the center aisle, where she could see both the dock and the security areas. She didn't want her presence to alter the behavior of those in the courtroom, if they behaved differently because they knew their superiors were watching. Then justice would be maintained by fear, not morality. She opened her briefcase, took out a printout of the case, and a notebook. Every detail, every reaction, the lawyers, the judge, the security guards would be recorded, not by review, but by the sharp, responsible analysis of a former federal prosecutor. Naomi had never shied away from confrontation, but she had never used her authority to intimidate. What she believed, and what she stood for, was that the justice system should stand on its own without constant supervision. Naomi didn't need anyone to give her a seat. She didn't need to be recognized. No privilege. She came to listen, to observe, to know the truth. It was a quality that had helped her climb to the top of an organization that didn't favor people like her. Baltimore. The daughter of a night nurse and a factory worker, Naomi had learned that resilience wasn't a slogan, but a daily battle. She'd studied through gunfire in middle school. She'd worked at a gas station while studying for the LSAT. She hadn't forgotten that past, because it was the reason she was here today. The solemn atmosphere of the courtroom had initially reassured her. But then, little by little, chaos began to creep in. Loud laughter from across the room, swearing. A bit of commentary about the weekend's soccer games. She turned. 2 security guards were standing near the side door, talking as if they were at an after-hours bar. Naomi frowned. She looked around. A young lawyer grimaced. An old woman rubbed her grandson's back, but no one dared to speak. And that was when Naomi stood up. She hadn't expected anything to happen. She had only meant to remind, gently, the others, so they wouldn't be interrupted while they prepared for the trial. An act that any citizen had the right to do, and that she, as a senior civil servant, had the responsibility to do. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I know the trial hasn't started yet, but this space needs to be kept quiet so everyone can prepare," she said in a soft, clear voice. "I would appreciate it if you could lower your voices, thank you." Simple, polite, inoffensive. And then she saw Brent Maddox's eyes boring into her, as if she had just insulted the honor of her country. "Who are you to give me orders?" he growled. "If you don't like it, get out." Naomi understood then. This was no longer a matter of keeping quiet. This was a bigger problem. Deeper. More dangerous. Naomi looked at him, her eyes unblinking, the eyes of someone who had seen too much injustice under the guise of law. She did not shout. She did not retreat. She simply said, "I do not command, I warn, because I believe that justice is cooperation, not fear." Naomi Carter, her hair curled back and her makeup minimal, made no one notice her as she walked through the security checkpoint. But she knew every step she took today carried the weight of an oath to defend justice, even when it was against its own keepers. She once said in an interview, "Justice doesn't need me to wear a robe or sit on a bench. It needs me to be there when no one else dares to be there." And that's exactly why she was here. A week before this trial, she received an anonymous email. Just a few lines unsigned. "If you really care about justice, come to Ashford Courtroom 5. No notice, for no title, just your eyes and your conscience." She had received hundreds, if not thousands, of such calls for help. But this time, something inside her rang like a small bell, but it rang far. Naomi didn't tell anyone in the office. She left a note for her secretary. "I'll be gone for a few hours Monday morning." No official schedule. That loneliness, that solitary commitment wasn't because she didn't trust anyone. It was because she understood sometimes to see the truth. You have to go into the dark alone. Naomi's gentle reminder lasted less than 15 seconds, but its impact on Brent Maddox was like a public slap. The anger in his eyes didn't come from the volume of her voice, but from her gender, her skin color, and the calm gaze of a woman of color demanding that he respect the rules. Brent Maddox couldn't accept that he didn't say it, but all those years in a system that allowed him to act as he pleased had taught him a woman of color is not allowed to correct a white man's mistakes. A request from an outsider could only be interpreted as a threat, and so the reminder, while perfectly reasonable, became an excuse for repression. She could have revealed her identity at that moment, asked for protection, or responded with power. But she didn't, because she wanted to see whether the system had the courage to regulate itself without anyone telling her to. And the answer, heartbreakingly, was no. Joel Ramsey, who had been silent and laughing along, now crossed his arms like he was standing guard outside a late-night bar. No one thought Naomi was a high-ranking observer, and that was the most tragic part, when a woman of color dressed smartly, spoke softly, and was still not considered worthy of respect. When Maddox asked, "Who are you?" Naomi didn't answer right away. For a brief moment, her mind raced through the scars. When she was a Yale student, a professor had told her bluntly, "You should consider studying social studies instead of law." It's not easy for a woman of color to survive in this environment. When she took the federal civil service exam, she was called a flag sign, an implication that she was chosen for her color, not her ability. And the first time she walked into a Justice Department meeting, a white colleague looked her up and down at her outfit and laughed. "You look like a model, but I hope you can read the law." Naomi had endured. Not because she was weak, but because she knew she was stronger. That was all she said. No anger, no retreat, no name-calling. And that was what made Maddox lose control. That one small word, from someone he considered insignificant, challenged both his arrogance and his illusions of power. Naomi turned back to her seat, her eyes briefly meeting the young secretary sitting in front of her. They said nothing, but there was understanding in their eyes, as the two women knew well when you dare to speak up, you become a target. No one remembers the exact moment when things began to go awry. But if there was one, it was when Officer Brent Maddox's eyes locked on Naomi Carter's placid face, and something in him, an arrogance challenged by a quiet confidence, began to crack. Naomi hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't put anyone down. But her very presence, a woman of color, well-spoken, professionally dressed, educated, had been a blow to the underlying belief Brent Maddox had long harbored that people like him were the ones who set the tone here. As Naomi returned to her seat, Maddox approached. He stood across from her, his hands on his hips, as if he were guarding the door to his own private prison. His gaze was a mixture of anger, suspicion, and insult. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, not expecting a response. Naomi raised her head and looked him straight in the eye. No blinking, no faltering, just a quiet, mirror-like gaze that reflected back all the mediocrity of the authority Maddox was trying to project. In the right corner of the courtroom, Joel Ramsey, the second security officer, still stood with his arms crossed against the wall, his expression half indifferent, half curious. Joel was not a spokesman nor a leader. He was the type of person who stood behind a stronger person to avoid responsibility. But when he saw Maddox reacting, Joel knew it was time to choose sides, and he chose to snort when Maddox repeated himself once more. "You should leave this courtroom before I begin to doubt your intentions here." Naomi stood up slowly, not to leave, but to stand tall in the face of oppression. "I don't need to leave. I have the right to be present in an open court," she said clearly, each word cutting through the air. She had met many people like Maddox in her career. They were not necessarily evil, but they were morally weak, accustomed to using the guise of power to avoid looking in the mirror. What angered Naomi was not the rudeness, but the normalization of it, as if insulting a woman of color was expected, and those who resisted were the rebels. She thought back to the investigations she had led. Their men like Maddox always had one thing in common. They didn't hate the law. They just hated being reminded of it by someone of another kind. "I'm not giving orders, officer. I'm making a polite request. And if you find a reminder of order offensive, then perhaps it's not me who should be examining my attitude." Naomi said, her voice still even, but her face had turned noticeably cold. At this point, Maddox began to wave his hand. "Ah, that's the type," he sneered. "The type who comes to the courtroom not to hear the verdict, but to cause trouble. One of those fighters for justice, right?" Naomi didn't react, but her eyes said it all. "If you're trying to provoke me, I'm not a pawn in your emotional chessboard." Brent Maddox was no longer in control of his reaction. He felt like he was being pushed into a weak position, and to regain his power, he had to punish the woman who dared to stand before him. "I'm asking you to produce your papers now. I suspect you of disorderly conduct and trespassing," Maddox said, his eyes flickering with a strange satisfaction. Joel Ramsey nodded. "That seems right. She doesn't seem to belong here." Naomi took a deep breath. Her hands, still on her bag, began to clench, but her voice was low, steady. "I am under no obligation to produce identification in this situation. I am not suspected of any wrongdoing, and you have no right to demand it without cause." The room was tense. People in the audience began to whisper. A few pulled out their phones, then put them away. No one was sure what was going on. They saw only a woman of color being surrounded by 2 court marshals, asking her to remain silent. "You refuse to cooperate, Joel, handcuff her." The words, short, cold, and full of authority, were like a whistle blowing the official crack in the heart of the legal system. Naomi did not struggle, but she looked up at Joel Ramsey, who was approaching, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and submission. "If you do this, you are arresting a citizen who has not broken any law, and you will be held accountable." Joel paused. For a moment, very briefly, Naomi saw something in his eyes that looked like hesitation. But a second later, Maddox's nod erased it. Joel grabbed her wrist. As her hands were clasped behind her back, Naomi Carter did not cry, nor beg, nor scream in anger, as others might have done in such circumstances. Instead, she stood tall. The courtroom shrank around her lone figure. In her gray suit, now slightly wrinkled from the strain, and her white silk scarf askew from her collar, Naomi stood like an unyielding beacon in the eye of a storm of abuse. Not a sound. No one breathed. Brent Maddox, for a brief moment, stood still, as if he had just heard a sentence that had struck at his pride. Joel Ramsey, who had been holding her arm, loosened his grip. He looked at Maddox as if waiting for further orders or a retreat. But Maddox, like a beast that had charged into battle, could not stop. He roared, "I don't care who you are. I'm the peacekeeper here, and you're causing a disturbance. I have the authority to remove you from the courthouse." Naomi nodded slightly, but not in agreement, as a sign that she understood everything. The truth was, no matter how many titles, how many laws she told them, they wouldn't believe her. Not because they didn't know the law, but because they didn't want to believe that someone like her could be the lawkeeper. "You don't have the authority to remove me from the courthouse just because I told you to keep order, and you certainly don't have the authority to use force to restrain a citizen who is exercising his or her right to do so," she said, her eyes never leaving Maddox. The air was thick, as if the room were about to explode from the tension of every breath Naomi had seen. Many arrests. She had read hundreds of internal reports, cold testimonies, blurry camera footage, but never in her life had she imagined that one day she would be treated as a troublemaker in the very space she had devoted her life to protecting. Her eyes locked on Brent Maddox, who stood with his arms crossed, his eyes triumphant. And then, for the first time since entering the courtroom this morning, Naomi let her real voice, that of a high-ranking legal official, speak clear and loud. "You have committed an unlawful seizure. I am the Deputy Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice, and I am present in open court as a lawful observer." There was no sound. No one breathed. Brent Maddox, for a brief moment, stood still, as if he had just heard a sentence that had struck at his pride. Joel Ramsey, who had been holding her arm, loosened his grip. He looked at Maddox as if waiting for further orders or a retreat. But Maddox, like a beast that had charged into battle, could not stop. He roared, "I don't care who you are. I am the one who maintains order here, and you are causing a disturbance. I have the right to remove you from the courthouse." Naomi nodded slightly, but not in agreement, but as a sign that she understood everything. The truth was, no matter how many titles, how many laws she told them, they would not believe her. Not because they did not know the law, but because they did not want to believe that someone like her could be the one who kept the law. "You do not have the right to remove me from the courthouse just because I told you to keep order, and you certainly do not have the right to use force to restrain a citizen who is exercising his or her lawful right," she said, her eyes never leaving Maddox. The air was thick, as if the whole room was about to explode from the tension of every breath. Naomi didn't back down. She knew what happened when a black woman said no. American history was littered with trials, indictments, and press images of black people being silenced for not saying no. But Naomi wasn't a victim. She was a living witness to a system that needed to change. "I've kept quiet enough," she said, her voice no longer her own, but an echo of generations of women who had been pushed into the shadows. "Now, I'm going to speak, and you're going to listen." A young lawyer in the audience quietly turned on her phone camera. An older woman wiped her eyes with a tissue. Shame filled the air, not just because of Maddox's behavior, but because of the silence of the crowd. Naomi, handcuffed, now held her head high, as if she were judging Maddox. "You're not suppressing me. You're suppressing the idea that a black woman can demand respect in a courtroom." And that, she paused, her eyes locked on his, "is what scares you the most." He stepped forward, roaring, "Enough! Get her out! Get her out of this courthouse!" Joel Ramsey, still holding Naomi's hand, looked around. He slowed down. Something was shaking. Maybe it was the onlooker's eyes. Maybe it was vague fear. But he did as he was told. He began dragging Naomi toward the center of the room. Naomi didn't resist with violence. She resisted with calm, even as she was being dragged. Her eyes remained on Maddox, a declaration without shouting. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of being handcuffed. I'm afraid of the silence of good people." As her arm was yanked forward, Naomi leaned forward, her shoulders tensing, not letting herself stagger like a criminal. A few people jumped out of their seats. Others began recording openly. A reporter quietly turned on his tape recorder. Something no one could name, it had begun to shift, not in Maddox, not in Ramsey, but in the people watching. Naomi stopped in the middle of the courtroom, turned around, and looked toward the judge's bench. Empty. "I didn't come here to confront. I came here to listen. But I'm not going to leave here quietly, because I didn't come here to be comfortable. I came here to see if the law really works." A terrible silence filled the room. Joel Ramsey's grip tightened as he dragged Naomi toward the main doors of the courtroom. Her footsteps echoed against the cold stone floor, echoing in the now graveyard-silenced space. No one dared to speak. No one dared to stop. No one stepped between her and injustice. Naomi Carter, Deputy Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice, was being dragged away like a criminal under the gaze of attorneys, court, clerks, relatives of the accused and the injured, and a few onlookers with trembling hands on their phones. And the most painful thing wasn't her wrists red from the cold steel cuffs. It was the gaze of the crowd, silent, evasive, or worse, loving and heartbroken. Naomi could feel her footsteps beating like a funeral drum. Not for her, for the temporary death of justice in the very place it was built to protect. A small child, no more than 6, sat on the bench with his grandmother. He stared at her, unblinking. His eyes bewildered. Naomi looked back, and for a brief moment she saw herself as a child. She had sat in the back row of the neighborhood courthouse, too, when her father had been wrongly convicted of obstructing an officer in the execution of his duty. All because he had stood up to defend a black student who had been wrongly arrested on the street. She remembered her mother's eyes that day, red but held high, her hands clutching the hem of her dress as if holding on to the last shred of dignity. Now she stood in that position again. But the difference was she couldn't cry. She couldn't fall. Naomi didn't struggle. She didn't scream. But with each step she pushed against the pull, refusing to be dragged along like a sack. She walked small but steady steps, as if she had chosen this path. Ramsey was irritated, he growled. "Cooperate. You're making things difficult for yourself." Naomi turned to him, her voice hoarse but clear. "I do not cooperate with wrongdoing, and I am not making things difficult for myself. I am making things difficult for your conscience." A man who appeared to be a lawyer was filming from a distance. A woman took out her phone to take pictures. A court employee looked around nervously, as if meeting Maddox's eyes would get her fired. They all saw it, but no one dared to act. They were choosing safety over justice. And Naomi knew that choice was what fed injustice every day. Ramsey pulled Naomi toward the door, a heavy wooden door through which was the main hallway, where everyone, prosecutors, defendants, victims' families, and the public, would enter. Naomi knew if she were pushed into that hallway handcuffed, she would not only be humiliated, but the image would live on forever on social media, becoming evidence for some rumor about her troublemaking or abuse of power. The truth always needed to be explained, but a lie only needed a photo, and she was about to become that photo. She had faced mafia men, interrogated murderers, supervised national investigations, but she had never felt so alone. Not because she was handcuffed, but because no one was on her side in the sea of people. Not a word of protest from those who knew the law better than anyone. Not a hand raised to stop the obvious wrongdoing. Not a voice saying, "Wait, she has her reasons." She was left alone. Alone in a room full of people. She knew tears would only satisfy them. She knew that if she fell, they would use that to conclude that she was weak, not fit to uphold the law, and so Naomi raised her head again. Her eyes were moist, but no tears fell. Instead, she used those eyes to stare at each person in the room. No resentment, no blame, just disappointment and a pain that went to the bone. If tomorrow one of you sitting here is arrested for daring to speak up, who will stand up for you? She said loudly, not shouting, but clear as a bell. No one answered Naomi, even as she was being dragged away. Was still inspiring. A young girl in a gray suit in the back row suddenly stood up, said nothing, just quietly turned on her camera to record the scene. A middle-aged man sighed, looked towards the door as if he wanted to do something, then sat down again. The change did not come suddenly, but it began. And that in that moment gave Naomi something not power, but the belief that she was not completely alone. Just before she was pushed through the door leading to the main hallway, Naomi stopped. Ramsey tugged at her arm to pull her away, but she turned back, her voice breaking, not from weakness, but from too much unnamed pain. What I lost today was not my reputation, not my position. It was the belief that those who knew the law best chose to remain silent the most. The heavy wooden door behind the judge's stand remained closed, as if the world of justice had chosen to turn its back on the woman being dragged through its own temple. Naomi Carter was nearing the end of her rope. She was handcuffed. She was being dragged through the indifferent gaze of the public. She was being insulted by those who called themselves custodians of law and order, and now before her was the main hallway door through which she would be pushed out like a foreign object, like a thorn to be removed from the false picture of order. Naomi had never felt so alone. Not because no one was there, but because everyone chose not to look. She was walking in the desert, carrying within her an oasis of faith that the world around her had deliberately buried. Her hands ached from the tight grip of the handcuffs, but the deeper pain was in the invisible place, the dignity trampled between people who had sworn allegiance to justice. As Ramsey prepared to push the door open to drag her out like a living sentence, a sound rang out, deep, sharp, clear in every beat. Stop immediately. The voice was not high, not angry, but it had the weight of a final sentence, and it came from behind, from the direction of the judge's stand. Everyone turned. The wooden door, which had been silent like an emotionless witness, now opened with a resounding creak of its hinges. Standing there was Judge Theodore Whitmore, in a dark black robe, a stern face, a bright gaze, and a presence that seemed to tear the stuffy air in the room. Whitmore, 62 years old, neatly gray-haired, tall, a former federal prosecutor, a man known for his principles and strictness in trials. He was not a sympathetic man, but he was a man who would never accept injustice in the guise of the law. As he entered, his eyes met Naomi's, and he stopped. The hand holding the file almost fell. His expression changed from stern to surprised, then angry. "What is going on here?" His voice rang out, not loud, but with the force of a church bell on Sunday morning. Brent Maddox paled. Ramsey let go of Naomi's hand, as if he were holding a red-hot iron. She staggered a little, but stood firm, her eyes fixed on the man who had appeared as her last ray of hope. Maddox stepped forward, stammering, Sir, this is just a troublemaker." She refused to produce papers, caused a disturbance, resisted the security force's requests. I was only exercising the authority given to me. Whitmore walked down the steps. His eyes stopped at the shiny silver cuffs on Naomi's wrists. He wasn't looking at Maddox anymore. He was looking at Naomi hard. And then, realization, Deputy Inspector General Naomi Carter, he said, his voice filled with a hint of guilt. The room froze. A woman in handcuffs, now a symbol of the nation's highest legal authority. Brent Maddox froze. Ramsey held his breath. Everyone turned to Naomi. their eyes shifting from suspicion to astonishment, from pity to fear. Naomi nodded, no longer hiding it. Yes, I came to observe this trial as an independent observer from the Department of Justice, and instead of being heard, I was humiliated. Whitmore was red with anger. He turned to Maddox. What have you done? Handcuffed a federal official in a courtroom without legal justification. Maddox couldn't answer. Ramsey took a step back. Whitmore turned to Naomi. He stepped forward, using his hands to undo each link of the handcuffs, as carefully as removing shackles from a soldier's hand. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said, his voice low and sincere. I can't believe this happened under the roof. I swore to protect. Naomi nodded slightly. Her voice was still calm. I didn't expect privilege. I only expected to be respected as a citizen. And today, that was denied. The room erupted, not in noise, but in trembling silence. Maddox and Ramsey were now not just confused. They were broken. Their eyes were filled with panic. They knew. They had nowhere to go. And what had just happened was recorded every moment. Naomi standing upright was not just vindicated. She was a living witness to the wrongs that could be exposed if we did not keep quiet. He turned to his secretaries and ordered, all records related to this camera footage incident reports must be sealed immediately. All facts are to be considered evidence in a high-level internal investigation. Today's hearing will be adjourned until I have a full report from all parties, including testimony from Deputy Inspector General Carter. She looked around. Those who had been silent now bowed their heads. A few stepped forward to ask questions, apologize, hand out tissues. She did not need them to cry for her, but at least they had seen. They had witnessed, and they could no longer pretend not to know. Naomi squeezed her wrists, now free, and said softly, just enough for herself to hear, "Justice is not dead. It sleeps in fearful hearts." As soon as the last handcuff was removed from Naomi Carter's wrist, the entire room seemed to shed a layer of mask that everyone was wearing. From the seemingly innocent eyes of the public to the fake coldness of the court staff, everything began to shake. It was no longer a scene of a troublemaker being dragged out of the court. It was no longer an officer on duty. The truth was gradually revealed. Undeniable, impossible to disguise Brent Maddox, who had once raised his voice, once roared like a supreme law-abiding man, now bowed his head, not daring to look at anyone. His shoulders trembled slightly, as if his body was betraying the false confidence he had shown. Joel Ramsey stood there, stunned. The hand that had once pulled Naomi pushed her away from the position she deserved to stand in, now hung limply, as if it had no more strength left. He looked towards the door, as if he wanted to run away, but all eyes were locked on them, like the hammer of conscience swinging. Whitmore looked at both of them, each word as if sealing the verdict. You have done something unforgivable. Not only insulted a federal official, but seriously damaged the honor of this court. She did not step forward as a victor, not as a gloater, not as a triumphant person. She stepped forward as a person whose dignity had been restored, and who wanted to restore the trust of those who had lost it. Naomi's steps were not to the podium. They were to the heart of a moral case, and this time she was the witness, the victim, and the judge. She stopped in the middle of the room, turned to the crowd, her voice ringing out clearly. I am not here to claim privilege. I am not here to bully anyone. I am here for everyone to witness what happens when we remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. I came here this morning as an independent observer. No notice, no entourage. I wanted to see how the law works when no one is watching, and it's painful to watch how it deviates from the moral high ground because of a polite reminder. Maddox bowed his head. Ramsey closed his eyes. They don't know who I am. They don't care who I am. They see my color, my gender, and they think I have no right to speak up. This isn't an isolated incident. It's the system, and the system only changes if we dare to call it out. I'm sorry. A middle-aged woman, the court's administrative clerk, stood up. I was there when you were taken away, and I didn't do anything. I can't forgive myself. The courtroom fell silent. A man, the defense attorney, also stood up. I saw it too. and I was afraid. But today, I understand. Silence is complicity, Maddox. In a moment of loss of control, fell to his knees. Ramsey followed, his hands shaking, his voice sobbing like a child. We were wrong. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were a troublemaker. I just followed orders. Followed orders. Naomi looked at them, not with contempt, but with deep sadness. If I wasn't the Deputy Inspector General today, would you apologize? They didn't answer. No one could answer that question. Naomi turned to Whitmore. The judge nodded, signaling that she had full authority to speak. I want this on the record. I want the entire case file sent to the Inspector General and the Justice Department. Not for revenge, but to prevent anyone else from going through what I just went through. The older woman holding her grandchild in the corner stood up and walked toward Naomi. You did what many people wouldn't dare. You're not alone. The younger man raised his hand to speak. I was dragged out of a courtroom for wearing a hoodie. Today I felt protected for the first time. Whitmore nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. The trial hasn't started yet. But perhaps a trial of justice has just begun. Naomi left the courtroom shortly afterward. She didn't win a case. She didn't put anyone in jail, but she made an entire system look in the mirror. And perhaps from that day on, anyone wearing the uniform of power will think carefully before acting. 3 hours after leaving the courtroom that day, Naomi Carter sat alone in the temporary office of the Federal Attorney General at the Ashford County Administrative Center. In front of her was a laptop already running internal security software. The screen lit up with the headline, Memo to the Federal Inspector General's Office. Confidential immediate action required. She was no longer wearing the dark suit that had been wrinkled from the incident. Instead, she wore a simple white shirt, the cuffs still marked by the handcuffs she had used that morning. Naomi began to write, not like a public official, but like a wounded citizen standing up to demand justice from the very system she had once trusted. Naomi's report was more than 17 pages long, each line as sharp as a knife, not only recounting what had happened, but also dissecting every wrongdoing, every loophole in the legal process that Brent Maddox and Joel Ramsey had exploited. She listed abuse of the right to check citizen documents without legal basis, forcible enforcement without verification of identity, intentional acts of insulting citizens with signs of racial and gender discrimination, covering up and distorting the truth right at the scene with the presence of many witnesses. Each line she typed was a hammer blow to the old frame of a system that seemed impregnable. Just an hour after Naomi pressed send, the report reached the hands of the Federal Inspector General, the head of the Justice Department's Office of Internal Control, and the National Office of Public Service Ethics. Within 24 hours, the directives appeared one after another. Immediate suspension of Brent Maddox and Joel Ramsey. Seal all security records and equipment in Courtroom 5. Establish a special investigation committee on abuse of authority at the Court Order Protection Agency. Coordinate directly with the Office of Human Rights Justice to conduct a comprehensive audit of districts where internal complaints have been reported that have not been thoroughly resolved. Naomi did not sit idly by. She requested permission to serve as an independent monitoring consultant for the entire investigation process. Her request was approved that same night. The next morning, an emergency meeting of more than 200 officials from the state and federal justice systems was convened. Naomi appeared, not as a victim in need of apology, but as the first to ask the question, are we really protecting justice, or just protecting the sense of security of those in power? No one could answer that question immediately, but it set off a chain reaction that no one could stop. An independent team of investigators led by the FBI and the Office of Inspector General reviewed the disciplinary records of all Ashford County Courthouse security guards over the past 5 years, and the results were shocking. More than 46 complaints of violent or offensive behavior toward citizens. Of those, 29 involved women or people of color. Most of the complaints were dismissed after the officers involved filed false reports for lack of substantial evidence. Now, in the light of the facts, the entire old system of justification is broken. Cases that had been forgotten were now being re-examined with new eyes, with new standards, no longer easy. A week after the incident, Naomi was invited to testify before the Special Judicial Ethics and Civilian Protection Subcommittee in Congress. The hearing was televised live to millions of viewers across the United States. In a simple blue suit, Naomi stood under the spotlight before the cameras and before a listening nation. "I thought my career was over when I was dragged from the courtroom in handcuffs, but that humiliating moment opened my eyes and America's to something more important than my position: vigilant justice." She wasn't exaggerating. Every word she uttered was the crystallization of the blood tears and hurt she had endured, not for herself, but for those who had no voice. Naomi's revelations didn't stop at Ashford Court. Security agencies in 35 other states were asked to review their entire operating procedures, hiring practices, and internal oversight. The Justice Department created an independent civilian oversight fund, empowering citizens to review county law enforcement agencies. A new bill was introduced in the Senate, Naomi's Law, which would require cameras at all points of interaction between citizens and court security officers and create a permanent community justice commission. She never considered herself a hero. But after the incident, hundreds of people sent letters, emails, and videos thanking her, from black students who were kicked out of the courtroom for wearing hoodies to women who were scrutinized when they showed up to court with relatives. Naomi responded with a single sentence, handwritten, and sent back to everyone: "Thank you. But remember, if I stay silent, once it will happen to someone else." Naomi's report found more than 220 administrative freezes in Ashford County over the past 10 years. They included reports of abuse of power by security guards against homeless people, victims' forced alterations of testimony, even CCTV footage of courthouse staff yelling and shoving people with disabilities, never prosecuted. Naomi called for a special team, free from local interests, to re-examine each case, and she did what no one else dared to do: contact the people who had been hurt and ask them to tell their stories. Late one night, Naomi received a call from Janelle Brown, a black woman who had been publicly humiliated by Maddox in 2018. When she had only come to get a copy of their divorce papers, "I tried to forget about it. I thought if I kept quiet, things would be easier." Naomi replied, her voice soft and firm. "Silence makes them breathe, but you still suffocate. I need you to speak up. Not for me, but because you deserve justice as much as anyone." The next day, Janelle agreed to be the third witness in the joint report, and like a domino effect, those who had been buried under the carpet began to rise. The federal government, in coordination with local organizations, held an open justice conference in Ashford, the first since 1991. Naomi stood in the middle of the 800-person auditorium and saw people who had been evicted from court for inappropriate dress, people who had been shouted at for speaking Spanish, black people who had had their papers checked for sitting in the public. They were all there, not to protest, but to contribute to a rewrite of how the system treats people. Naomi began in a whisper, but it reached the heart of the audience. "If justice is light, then it is you, not me, who turn the switch." Thanks to public pressure and Naomi's powerful testimony, Congress made 3 major changes to the county justice system nationwide: require citizen representation on judicial protection officer selection boards, automatically reopening old complaints if new evidence is found, even if the administrative deadline has passed, increasing funding for independent surveillance cameras, not under the control of the person being complained about. When interviewed by national television, the reporter asked, "After all you've been through, what makes you want to stay in this system?" Naomi paused, then answered slowly, "Because if I leave, they win. They think a handcuff, that's all it takes to silence people like me. But they're wrong. A handcuff doesn't lock trust, and I'm here to fix the lock." She was no longer acting alone. Dozens of people who had been silent now stood by her. They launched a Silence is Complicity campaign, spreading across major states. They held civil rights workshops in the courthouse, taught how to behave properly when under pressure, and most importantly, they turned every citizen into a gatekeeper of justice. No armor, just courage. Brent Maddox and Joel Ramsey weren't just fired. They were charged with abuse of power under color of law, unlawful arrest, systemic racism. They hired lawyers, tried to cite mistake, incomplete, process unknown, victim. But this time they were no longer talking to a single woman. They were talking to an entire society that had just woken up. A month after the incident in courtroom 5, the city of Ashford entered autumn. The leaves turned a brilliant red-brown, covering the square where the federal courthouse stood. A building that had once been a witness to shameful silence, and also the beginning of a quiet but powerful wave, a rebirth of faith. People gathered in large numbers. There were faces that had once turned away in the courtroom. There were staff members who had once been timid, not daring to look Naomi Carter in the eye. There were students, teachers, workers, even people who had been pushed out of the courtroom for not being in the right form. Everyone stood there, waiting to hear a name called. Naomi Carter, the city's mayor, along with representatives of the federal judiciary and the National Human Rights Council, officially presented Naomi with the Medal for Civic Integrity, an unprecedented honor given to a sitting official who had been publicly humiliated. She did not retreat. She did not remain silent. She turned shame into a weapon and truth into a flag that no one dared to lower. When Naomi stepped up to the podium, no one spoke. No one applauded right away. Everyone stood still, not out of indifference, but because too many emotions were swirling. Naomi looked out at the sea of people. The autumn wind blew gently, fluttering the hem of her dark blue coat. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice was clear enough, steady enough to contain all that she had been through. I was handcuffed in the place that was supposed to protect me, but today I stand here not because I won, but because I didn't leave. And I know everywhere in this country there are people like me not waiting to be insulted to speak, but speaking, so that no one else has to. From the front row, a boy named Malik, only 11 years old, who had witnessed Naomi being dragged away in the courtroom, stepped onto the stage and quietly handed her a drawing. On the paper was a picture of a woman in a law robe holding a torch with the word truth engraved on it. The boy said softly, hesitantly, "I don't know what the law is, but I know. From the moment I saw you standing there, I want to be good." Naomi hugged the boy. For the first time in her life, she cried. But they were the tears of someone who weathered the storm and saw the sun. Immediately after the ceremony, a series of editorials were published in major newspapers. The Washington Post. Naomi Carter. When integrity refused to kneel. The Atlantic Justice has a name, and it's not always wearing a robe. NPR. From handcuffs to the roster. The journey to transform a system that seemed unable to bow. Many law schools have included the Naomi Carter case in their legal ethics curriculum. She was invited to speak at TEDx conferences, but Naomi didn't accept many invitations. She chose to return to her old office, continuing to write reports, review files, and advise on reforms. "I'm not here to be a star. I'm here to make sure the next person doesn't have to be me." In December of that year, the trial of Brent Maddox and Joel Ramsey officially took place. No noise, no press overload, but it was so solemn that it was breathtaking. Naomi didn't need to say much. The surveillance cameras, the testimony, and the initial silence of the crowd were the proof. Both were found guilty of abuse of public authority under the color of law, systemic discrimination, insulting the honor of a senior citizen, causing serious consequences to the public trust, sentence 2 years in federal prison, and a permanent ban from re-employment in any organization related to public authority. The night the trial ended, Naomi didn't throw a party, didn't speak to the media. She just went home, poured a cup of hot tea, and wrote in a black notebook. Justice isn't about who wins. Justice is about who has the courage not to look away. No fuss, no sacralization. But true. Every time someone walks into a courtroom and sees a sign that says, "Please turn off your cell phones, keep quiet," they remember the woman who was handcuffed for asking for exactly that. Her name is the title of a new award from the Department of Justice, the Naomi Carter Award for Civilian Courage, given annually to people who speak up in difficult circumstances. And if you ask, "Who is Naomi Carter?" somewhere a schoolboy will answer. She never bows her head, even when everyone else turns their back. And because of that, she makes people turn around. You have just witnessed a story that sends chills down your spine, just imagining it. But it happened right here in America, in a federal courtroom in broad daylight with surveillance cameras, lawyers, civil servants, witnesses, and still no one stopped the wrongdoing. Naomi Carter, one of the highest-ranking officials in the Department of Justice, was treated like trash for speaking up. Not because she did something wrong, but because she was a woman of color who did not like those who were accustomed to using power as a weapon. So what would have happened if she had not been the Deputy Inspector General? Maybe she would have been locked up. Maybe no one would have believed her. Maybe the cameras would have accidentally failed. And maybe the system would have continued to deny it, as it has denied hundreds, thousands of other vulnerable people. But Naomi did not stay silent. And through that resilience, a whole web of wrongdoing is exposed. People who used their power to abuse their fellow citizens, now they must bow before true justice. This story is not just about Naomi. It is about you, about me, about anyone who has ever been silenced by fear, power, or loneliness. It asks a stark question. When you see wrongdoing, will you choose to stay silent or will you be the one to stand up? If Naomi doesn't stand up today, it's very possible that the men who handcuffed her will continue to abuse others. And each time society slides further away from what's right. We can't change the system with one story, but we can start by sharing the truth, by refusing to turn our backs on victims, by calling wrongdoing by its true name. Like if you feel this story touches your heart, comment below to express your opinion. What would you think if the person who was offended that day was your mother, your sister, or yourself? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the real emotional and awakening stories that we will continue to bring. Because justice sometimes does not come from the court, but from you, the one who is listening.